Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight on a fairly muggy evening. It's a pleasure to have you all here. I think actually we're almost coming to a decade of doing these public seminars, so I'm immensely grateful for many of you who've been coming, twice a term, 6 times a year for over a decade. It's a great pleasure to have 5 speakers with us here today, and I'll introduce them shortly. The focus of this seminar. And the format is, maybe many of you probably know, we ask 4 or 5 speakers to pitch their 5-minute ideas to answer a topical question. And the question we're asking our speakers today is, what can we learn from villages and small towns for tomorrow's sustainable cities? And that fits in with essentially what can we learn from the past and the present towards future and current sustainable urban agendas. And my family comes from the East Midlands, so I grew up in small villages and market towns, and I went home last week and I realised this book has been sitting around a household. It's published in 1937, so it's probably been there from 1937. It's a portrait of a village by Francis Brett Young, and it's an interesting, by pure chance, it's a reflection really on what we'll be discussing today, in that Brett Young talks about rural life, about the village as an organism, talks about the social relations, talk about the fabric of the village, talks about the relationship between residents, workers and the built environment. But it was also writes not a romantic. It looks at the tensions and the challenges and the opportunities. So it's not a sentimental book of a bucolic past, but it was also written in 1937 at a time, you could say, of potentially global political uproar coming along, but also a time when modernity, urbanisation, particularly in the UK, was in some case jarring with or against traditional forms of village life. So it's a great read, 1937, available at all good bookshops probably 50 years ago, but also good probably in your library. So I'm delighted to have 5 speakers today who are going to, the format is they will give their pitch, their answer to this question, and then it's open up to the audience for discussion. There are refreshments, etc. afterwards. I'd also like to thank the Sustainable Urban Development students and alumni. I sent a call out saying, would anyone like to come and speak and join? And I got an overwhelming cascade of yes. And some of the work they're doing that connects rural urban development was really impressive. So I've promised we will do another revisit and allow all those people who wanted to speak to come and speak at a future seminar. So thank you for their interest, or your interest. So we have speakers, starting in this order. Stephen B is the chair of the Historic Town and Villages Forum. He's a principal of Stephen B Urban Council. He was a board member of Historic England and a chairman of the Academy of Urbanism. He's got over 40 years of experience at local and national level in the public and private sectors. And you excuse me for whizzing through some wonderful biographies and achievements, because I realise we're short of time and it's all about you, and certainly not about me in terms of chatting away. Lita Kazaka is the director of Studio LK. Lita is a chartered architect and urban designer, has worked with the Princess Foundation, has also worked with the King's Foundation as of now, and been one of the judges of our presentations at the Masters weeks. So that's been great. So it's great to see you again here in a different venue, but talking about similar issues. Pooja Ganatra is also joining us today. She's a senior consultant at Brewer Happold and also adjunct lecturer at Heriot-Watt University. Her research and work really has been in Mumbai and Riyadh and Dubai. There we are. And also was born and raised in Mumbai. And we have Dr. Fabio Zucca, who is a visiting fellow here at the GCHU. Fabio is a postdoctoral researcher at the Pense Institute and at University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. He's also an investigative journalist, so you can ask him about that. And also a lot of his research is coming from an environmental, social science perspective, but as an anthropologist. So he's done a lot of work in the Amazon. And our fifth speaker is Dr. Shreya Banerjee. She's an assistant professor at the Department of Architecture and Regional Planning at the Indian Institute of Technology in Kharagpur. And Shreya is also a visiting fellow at the GCHU. And so you'll be talking about some of the research and your experiences in terms of answering this question. And you're also a specialist in heat adaptation, human thermal exposure, and urban resilience. So I think we're all living that today in a minor way, but that's I think you'll be bringing that into your discussion. So I'm going to shut up and I'm going to invite Stephen to come to the podium.
Good evening, everybody. It's nice to be here. I've taken the liberty of changing the question, actually, so forgive me, because what we can learn from historic villages and towns is a huge subject that the Historic Towns and Villages Forum has been focusing on for almost 40 years now, and I'll mention something about that in a moment. But I want to talk about how we can learn from villages, how we can harmonise the messages that we receive, the languages that we use, and the terminology that we use, so that we can talk more consistently with each other, and also how we harmonise the values that we apply to these historic places as we plan for their future. So 5 minutes, I must better get on. I do want to say something quickly about the history of our organisation, which emerged from the English Historic Towns Forum in 1987, put together initially from a number of local planning authorities who were concerned with the growing tension between their responsibilities for conservation and caring for historic places, but also for promoting economic development and urban regeneration. So that was one aspect of where we sprang from. A little later, the Association of Small Historic Towns and Villages, ASHTAV, was established by a different group of interests coming from local town and parish councils and amenity societies, mainly in the wider Oxfordshire region, and places and people who felt that the focus on the larger towns and cities was neglecting the interests and concerns of smaller places. So we came together, getting on for 10 years ago, both being hosted here at Kellogg, to whom we're most grateful, and we formed the Historic Towns and Villages Forum. Within ASHTAV, there was a substantial bequest left to them very generously by one of their founding members, Herbert Lane, and that trust is now one of the sources of the income that keeps the Historic Towns and Villages active. So that's enough about us. So I'm just navigating my way around this screen. We've been around for 40 years. That's 40 years of discussion, debate, research, and sharing of good practice, good examples, case studies, and debate on how and why we should care for our historic places as best we can. And as a result of all of that work over those years, we've amassed a large archive of case studies, research projects, examples of places that we've learned to appreciate, and professional guidance, which is available through our archive. So we've got loads of that, which is why I'm focusing now on how we make use of it and how we encourage others to make use of what we've learned. Because one of the challenges is to get people to engage with their historic places and to understand, to want to understand them better, and to want to engage and make them better. And the way that we tend to get involved in our places is through the inspiration that they offer to us, the way that we subjectively respond to the character of the places that we care about. So those subjective values are an important reason why people first engage with places. So whether they're beautiful or ugly, whether they feel that the people feel that they're important, whether they are evocative of a particular character, all of these constructs are ways in which we are drawn into wanting to have an influence over the places where we live and work. Now the challenge then is that these constructs tend to be subjective. inevitably. And subjective values are, by definition, related to the individual. So trying to gather those together in a way which gives us a consistent and useful objective approach to solving the challenges that we're facing is a challenge. I was going to talk about this about the Building Better, Building Beautiful initiative that was promoted by the last government, which was very well-meaning but short-lived. Maybe we can come on to that in discussion, because I balanced that with the work that we did when I was at what was English Heritage, getting on for 20 years ago, when we produced our conservation principles as a Bible, a credo for a more consistent, more reliable, more objective approach to managing historic places. And at the core of that was the recognition of a set of objective values by which we might more objectively define, characterize historic places, and perhaps we might come on to that in discussion as well. So two different approaches: the subjective approach, which gets people interested, but then a more objective approach, which is necessary to use that engagement in a constructive and active way. And while we're going through this, there are other values that we need to take into account as well. The instrumental values of places, their utility, their usefulness, their economy, the internal and the wider economy that they influence, the efficiency with which they use the resources at their disposal, and of course the equity in which the resources are acquired and distributed. And at the highest order, highest level, there are the environmental values that we have to bear in mind. The climate emergency is an obvious example, but the threats of human activity on biodiversity is a continual problem, and also the concept of biophilia, the fact that we are, as human beings, we have an affinity with other living things and life processes. So all of these form a network of values within which we might better understand ourselves, our places, and how we can make better places for the future. Now, one of the challenges is aligning public policy with the public expectations that I've just been talking about. A few years ago, the Historic Towns and Villages Forum was part of a team led by Historic England, which produced this report towards a better balance between heritage and growth, which went back to the origins of the forum in seeking a reconciliation of conservation and prosperity, and produce guidance in an updated form, which I commend to you as well, and that's still available. Now, I mentioned the previous government's initiative. When the present government first came in a couple of years ago, they immediately updated the National Planning Policy Framework to address the housing emergency, and to introduce policies that might more reliably enable the building of 1.5 million houses over the dwellings over the lifetime of the government. Now, we'll all take a view on how successful that's likely to be. But the important thing about that intention, that worthy intention, was that it was intending not to spend so much time arguing over whether we should do something, but getting on with deciding how we should do it. And that's one of the things one of the contributions that I'd like to think the forum can influence. And finally, just to leave you with a thought, it's if we can help people to feel pride in their place, if we can help them to feel that they belong to their community, to their town, their village, then they're more likely to take an active role in its future. But in doing so, we need to make sure that that doesn't prejudice the interests of other members of the community, and perhaps most importantly, the interests of future generations. That'll do from me. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much indeed, Stephen. Lita, you're up next.
Yes. Shall I start the slides? That's not.
Oh gosh,
yeah.
I got the wrong way.
I don't know.
Yes.
Go through it.
Keep going. Okay.
Oh,
there we are.
there you are.
Perfect.
Okay,
yes,
great.
I think we're good. Okay.
Lita, over to you.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Just give me a minute to get my bearings on here.
Well, I'll fill in the gap.
Yeah. No. I think we're good. It's okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. And it's great to be here. Thank you for all coming along to hear us speaking. I am going to discuss 4 key lessons from traditional settlements that can help us create more sustainable settlements in the future. So lesson 1 will be living close to daily needs. Lesson 2 is using resources wisely. Lesson 3 is how we can work with nature. And lesson 4 is about building strong local communities. So first, looking back to move forward. When we think about sustainable urban living, we often imagine new technology, smart cities, and renewable energy. However, some of the most valuable lessons come from historical traditional villages and small towns. These settlements developed slowly, using local materials, local food production, and evolved around the practical needs of everyday life. While they lacked modern technology, they often used resources very efficiently, and they built beautifully. So if we look at this image here, this is of a depiction of England in 1200 AD. You can see that life was very simple. People, a farming community, the animals and the people in the street together, low-tech lifestyles. But if you look in the background and to the sides of these people, you see buildings which are very sophisticated. The buildings are use natural materials. They're easy to cool in the summer, easy to heat in the winter, and they're based on harmonic proportions, which means that the buildings are beautiful. And we use that word, Stephen also used the word, but when I say beauty, I mean mathematically beautiful. So it's an objective thing. And actually, even the street itself, the way it's designed, is based on the human scale, as of course are the buildings. So the first lesson is walkability. In many traditional villages and small towns, most daily activities had to be reached on foot because this was, of course, the main mode of transport then. Homes were located within a 5 minutes walk to shops and schools and markets and churches and workplaces, and this in turn reduced the need for infrastructure and energy consumption. We can therefore describe traditional towns and villages as walkable neighborhoods. And there have been recent attempts to rebrand the walkable neighborhood, but at the end of the day, the same simple principles apply. Walkable neighborhoods encourage social interaction and improve health because people are walking and, of course, exercising more. Walkable neighborhoods are more pleasant to experience as human beings because the streets have been designed around the human being. We would call this, in today's terms, placemaking. And the second lesson is efficient resource use. Traditional communities relied heavily on locally available materials such as stone and timber and clay and thatch. And transporting materials over long distances was expensive, so buildings generally used local resources. This resulted in locations having simple but uniquely characterful identities. So think of places, settlements like Castle Combe in Wiltshire, Bibury in Gloucestershire, and Helford in Cornwall. With this said, however, so I'm going to contradict myself, there were places, for example, like Pittenweem in Fife and some places in Norwich, which used materials such as the red pan tile, which were shipped from trading towns overseas. So although these materials were not local, they were limited. And so the use of these limited materials helped to shape these towns' characters as well. And you can see the picture of Pittenweem in the top right-hand corner is very iconic in its character and you can identify it immediately as one of the East Nuke villages. Sorry. There was also a strong culture of repair and reuse of these buildings. Buildings were designed to be flexible so that they could accommodate various uses, and because of this, they lasted for hundreds of years. Food was also produced locally, reducing the need to transport food, which meant food was fresh and organic and whole. So today, new settlements can learn from existing local vernacular precedent, which is characterful and responds to local climate. New settlements can use local supply chains where possible. New settlements can design buildings that adapt to changes and uses over time. They can use materials that have long lifespans and age gracefully. And finally, new settlements can also integrate food growing near to and within the settlement. So think of towns like, for example, Todmorden in West Yorkshire, also known as Incredible Edible, and also how Waltham Abbey used to produce most of London's vegetables. And that's one of the pictures from the Cucumber Festival in Waltham Abbey, which is still a festival that continues from the days in which Waltham Abbey was producing the majority of London's vegetables. And the third lesson is climate responsive design. So traditional buildings were often remarkably well adapted to their environment. Thick stone walls provided insulation, narrow streets created shade or protection from the wind. These are pictures from Orkney. And Orkney, if anybody's been, will know is very, very windy. So these streets have been designed to create shelter from the wind. And the stone slabs used on the roof have been used because the wind can't whip them off as they would do, for example, with tiles or slates. So rather than rely on air conditioning or mechanical heating, traditional buildings created comfortable spaces internally using traditional forms of construction. Courtyards and narrow streets encouraged natural cooling and ventilation. With current rising energy costs, architects are increasingly rediscovering these principles of passive design. And the final lesson is importance of community. Traditional villages and towns often have strong social connections. Public squares and markets and village greens and community buildings create unique opportunities for regular interaction and play, as well as incidental meetings. And when we mean incidental meetings, I think the top right-hand corner is a really good example of that, where people are just happen to bump into each other. Somebody's painting there. He might overhear the conversation and join in. And it's something that is very difficult to, say, factor in on a spreadsheet, but it's a quality that is very important to be considering when designing new places. And this social interaction increases a sense of belonging and reduces that feeling of isolation. We tend to think of sustainability as relating to energy and resources, but it actually is about creating places where people feel connected and safe and supported. Modern settlements can promote social capital by designing attractive public spaces and neighborhoods that encourage community activities. So in conclusion, traditional villages and small towns offer valuable lessons for sustainable urban living. While we cannot simply recreate the past, we can adapt these principles to modern settlements. By combining traditional wisdom and traditional urban design principles with modern technology, we can create urban environments that are more sustainable and enjoyable places to live. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Rita. Pooja, you're up next.
Can I use?
Slides should be straightforward. I'm going to mess up again.
Yeah, that's fine.
Is that good?
Perfect. Okay. I think great to set the context together because now I'm going to deep dive into a case study. So I think it's interesting to hear from Stephen and Lita about how, what's the kind of context of small towns and villages, and now kind of deep diving into what we can learn from a case study and something I've been a part of in from a Global South perspective. And sorry, can you see? Come on. Yeah, okay, sorry. And I have Mumbai there, but then a question mark, because it's a city, right? We don't consider it to be a small town or a village, but there is more context to it, which I'd like to deep dive into and then take you from in a journey rather to how this was sort of thought about and contextualized in my head. Really what the question is that every city is trying to rebuild the village from a point of there's greens and squares and pubs and halls and local supply chains and so on, but the richest living answer is not in a master plan as such, but it's in it sits in a 2.5 kilometer square in the dead center of Mumbai, working unplanned since the past 160 years. And what really happened there, right? For context, it's people moving from various villages within different parts of India into the central core of Mumbai to form this little settlement, right? So from Gujarat, from Tamil Nadu, from Uttar Pradesh, where you have really skilled workers like potters, embroiderers, and tanners who kind of come into this heart of the city to form their own community, their own small town, and then take their lineage from there. So that was something that grabbed my attention in terms of village or a small town is sort of people coming together, trying to create something that would, take their families and their homes forward, and then learn from, like, keep your core values together because you come from those the communal background and live in an urban dense city. And how do you survive through that as well, right? And they moved into the heart of Mumbai, where it's layered onto this 2.5 kilometer square in the exact city center of Mumbai, and it began in the 1850s. So this was when India was still colonized and we were still not independent really. But people started moving there to look at opportunities and identify what we can do for ourselves and form this little community, as I said. And it started to be known as Kolivara, which is like a fishing village. So where you kind of come in together, you have the coast by Mumbai. So as you can see, actually in the next image, you'll be able to see a little bit of what the context is and what the site looks like. But it's interesting to see how they looked at the opportunities and kind of came in there to create something for themselves and their families and the community. And eventually, it was located in between two railway lines. Now, when I say Dharavi, the first thing that comes to mind, it's an informal settlement, it's a slum, it's not a small town, it's so much worse, I would say, than a small town or a village. But in my perspective, and having gone there and been there and kind of interacted with a lot of people there for about a week or more, even though I come from Mumbai, I had never been there before, except for work, right? So, and I'll talk about that in a bit as well. It was super interesting to be a part of something that was around me, but I had no clue about the context and where it came from. And what really grabbed my attention was, as you can see, the location, right? So it's by the Arabian Sea. It's this massive area of land between two railway lines by the financial district of Mumbai, and just situated there in this massive sprawl of space, right? Everybody living together, everybody creating their little small town, surviving together, and kind of putting Mumbai or creating the heart of Mumbai with all of these different pottery and tannery, like leather tanning and so on, bringing that economy together in one place. And to give you more of a context, it's dozens of villages layered in one place. It's so dense, there are about 1 million residents in that place, which is one of the densest places on earth. Again, it doesn't sound like a small town, but for our context, it is a little small town there, right? And the estimated output from that little small town is about $1 billion US dollars because of the micro enterprises that run in there, right? And we'll dig into that a bit more. What are the little hallmarks? And these are some images that we've captured through our little tour there, as you can see me there with a little thumbs up. But these are some 3 hallmarks that we captured in terms of the overall density and the site visit that we did. And I'll also play a little clip at the end to give you more context. But what we took away from that, right? What we're here to define is that it was compact, walkable, mixed use areas and developments. So you had zero commute, basically, because everybody was just, their house and their work was just next to each other. So people used to wake up and there they are. It's like, did they use the 15-minute city concept was the first question we asked, because we now talk about it, but this was something that they developed back then and said that we don't need to commute to work. This is where we eat, sleep, work, and this is our life. The second was local resources and supply chain. We really felt like we were living in a circular economy model there, right? They had their own little cows that used to give them the cow dung that they used to use as, building blocks for certain areas. They used to use the surroundings for, creating their clay pots and so on. So they really kind of relied on their local supplies. And finally was the pride of living in Dharavi, which is quite a taboo in Mumbai, right? So if someone came and told me this item of food is produced in Dharavi, the first reaction of somebody would like, don't give it to me, this is probably unhygienic and I'm not gonna have it. However, more than 80% of food supplies in restaurants or like snacks in restaurants in Mumbai comes from Dharavi, but they never talk about it, right? Because that's the manufacturing ground. That is where everything is produced. That's where people are. That's where everything is. There are soap factories and so on. And we met with a couple of locals there in the last image. And the first thing they told us was, this is 5-star living for us. Okay, and we would never want to move out of this. This is where we belong. This is 8 generations of life. This is what we want to do, where we want to be, and you cannot take us away from here. Which really stayed back with us because they really take pride in their little small town or layered village that they've created for themselves in the heart of this mega city, and really surviving in their own little bubble, right? And another interesting fact was, because we went there post-COVID, they said we were not affected by COVID at all because it's already super unhygienic, that I think COVID couldn't really penetrate through them, and they were living their life. Nothing was affected, their factories were running fine, nobody was sick, and it was just perfect, right? And they did not allow anybody to get in, because they were like, if someone had COVID, they would probably, come in and infect us or whatever. So they were really secluded and in their own little bubble, and they had a blast. And to end this, I think it would be interesting to just hear, because it was a collaborative effort that we did with our team. So I work at Bureau Happold as a consultant, and we partnered with Sauer Architects and Priya, who are the participatory research organization in Asia, to kind of get this all together as a urban sea lab that you see there is sort of an internal drive that we have, where we just kind of go to mega cities and explore what they're doing and how we can learn from them. It's like a design sprint for 5 days at a stretch, which is very cool. So Jack, one of my colleagues, and me were vlogging in the streets, and I thought it would be an interesting way to kind of show you what happened there.
About where we are at right now.
It really is quite remarkable.
Yeah. What are your...
I mean, in so many ways, you've got whole economies here.
Yeah.
The jobs, you got education, the amount of industries. I mean, the waste recycling is amazing.
Yeah, of course, facilities.
I mean, talk about circular economy principles.
Yeah.
You have most of it here. It's just fun. It's not as healthy. It's not safe.
Yeah.
But you do have it. Pottery, just example, pottery over here.
Yeah.
There are a lot of fundamentals that for sure need to be rectified, but for the most part, these things that have emerged organically are the things we try and design into community. Yes. Okay, we need some recording.
Okay.
But that's really kind of to give you a little glimpse, because it's really hard to imagine what it would be like walking in this dense area. And that was just a little glimpse to show you what we saw and what our experience was like, and how we can really learn from this and take away for the big cities to take on with and from, and look at how we can be one communal society and take pride in where we live and are, and really grow from there. So yeah, that's me. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Pooja. I think Fabio is now going to take us to the Amazon, if I'm correct. Yeah. That's what you want. What's that?
Yeah.
Think about
Oh, what
where
we're done.
are
There we
at
are.
right now.
That's it. You're there.
Yeah, here. Okay, well, I'm a bit taller. Yeah, that works. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here this late afternoon. Thank you, David and Judith, for being amazing hosts while I'm here during this fellowship with you. And so I'm not an urban planner. I work mainly in the Brazilian Amazon with the environmental impacts and environmental consequences of large deforestation, agribusiness expansion. So for me, it has been quite challenging to engage with the question of today's seminar, and I hope I might be able to bring a meaningful twist on the question based on my field work and my extensive engagement with communities heavily affected by urban processes elsewhere, but with consequences for their livelihoods in the Amazon. So I believe that my main claim here is that Amazonian small towns and communities reveal what cities may often obscure, that urban life is inseparable from forests, rivers, food systems, and infrastructures. What I mean by that is that in many cities of the global north, urban life may appear to be detached from nature. Food arrives in supermarkets, minerals arrive as technologies, buildings, and infrastructures, and energy systems, and environmental harm transforms realities that appear to belong to distant localities. But this apparent separation depends on transformations that precisely happen in distant or not so distant ecologies. So, for example, deforestation for green base and animal protein, mining-related toxic contamination, disrupted rivers, and damaged territories. And it often creates dynamics in which, and that's particularly so in the global south, we have the benefits of extractive industries going elsewhere, traveling elsewhere, while communities living in close relation with forests, rivers, and land are left to deal with the environmental and have consequences of this global supply chain. So for me, perhaps, the question working in the Amazon is less how can cities become more sustainable within their own boundaries, and more how can urban life be sustained through ecological relations beyond those urban boundaries. So I think what the Amazonian communities make visible is that small towns and indigenous and riverside communities show that the ecological conditions of urban life. And I want to present that with two examples to you that are the core of my research that I've been developing also during my time as a fellow here. The first two images we have on the left are from the lower Tapajós. It's in the Pará state that perhaps doesn't mean a lot to you, but it's one of the most biodiverse parts of the Brazilian Amazon, located in the western part of Pará. And it's a region that has been heavily transformed during the last 2 decades by the advance of soybean agriculture. So schools, roads, and villages were transformed into zones of agrochemical exposure, and particularly glyphosate, which not only contaminates the soil crops, but also affects the very breathing capacity of the communities. And I mean breathing both in the most concrete sense. People choke, people have a hard time, they get asphyxiated amid glyphosate fumigation, and also in a metaphorical sense of asphyxiation, in the sense that the communities can no longer thrive in their territories, they're forced to leave, they have no means of keeping their livelihoods. And I've been calling this process expulsion by suffocation, a form of displacement produced by direct violence and land grabbing, involving based on these atmospheric and respiratory aspects of land dynamics in the Amazon. And the second example, which I was able to present last week here at Kellogg with in more detail is the case of the Banana Island, which is also in the frontiers between two of the most biodiverse biomes on the planet, the Amazon and the Cerrado, the savanna-like Cerrado in Brazil. And one could imagine that people would have a an easy time finding food and producing food from that land, but that's not the case at all since 1979, a big infrastructure project implemented in the region, hydraulic project to transform the whole hydraulic infrastructure of several rivers crossing this island into a hub for export of cheap grain-based proteins, mainly to Europe and to Asia now. And what's interesting in these communities in the Banana Island is that they are by no means becoming cities. They are not, there's not a process in which life feels like they are becoming a city in any sense, but there are a few characteristics and negative characteristics, I'll say, related to urbanization that has transformed their lives. One would be a stronger dependency on food produced in the supermarket, so they are no longer able to produce their own foods, and they depend highly on supermarkets and ultra-processed food with high levels of sodium and sugar, as we see in impoverished communities, impoverished neighborhoods across big cities. And also the change, the transformation in the river dynamics creates stagnant water, which facilitates, which helps the proliferation of mosquito-borne diseases that are also in Latin America typically associated with urban impoverished communities across Latin America. So I think what I'm trying to argue in this case, in the Banana Island, is that there is an overlapping of vulnerabilities. They are not getting any of the access one could imagine that would be associated with urban life, such as an increase in access to health, to the health system, or to education, or urban infrastructure, but they have to deal with an overlapping of vulnerabilities, both regarding life close to a forest region, a forest that has been much deforested in these last decades, and these vulnerabilities of an urbanization without cities, not being able to produce their own food. So what I think that this case, I wanted to bring this perhaps more as a question than as a proper answer that we could further discuss during the debate, is that what these Amazonian cases show us that we should not, at least in the case of the Amazon, romanticize villages or small towns as naturally sustainable, as they are heavily impacted by extractivism happening in their territories, and the benefits go elsewhere. So what I believe is that these settlements, they do reveal the ecological and social conditions that sustain urban life, and that so for me, the Amazon, this case that I'm bringing here to you in the Amazon, they help us ask a different question: how can settlements of different scales organize healthier and less unequal relations between people, infrastructure, and environments? So, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Fabio. I think, Freya, over to you for our final pitch and presentation. Then I'll ask the speakers to move to the front and we can fire questions at them. So, over to you.
Well,
That's a...
thank you so much. Yeah, that was a shift from the previous presentation. So I just have one slide, and so I'll talk about this one city, which is like a tier 2 city situated in the western part of India, and it's called Jodhpur. If some of you are familiar with the tourism scene in India, and if any one of you have traveled to India for tourism purpose, you would have probably come across the name of this city because it's a very prominent tourism destination with some 15th century forts, very fancy looking exotic neighborhoods, and a lot of colors and grandeur and all those things. And this is also a city of a population of about 2 million, which may sound a very big city, but given the sheer population in India, 2 million is actually considered a tier 2 city, because for the bigger cities, the populations are like 20 millions. So, and another interesting fact about this particular city is this, that this is actually situated right in the middle of a desert. So the western part of India has the Thar Desert, which is shared between the Indian state of Rajasthan, and there's also a bit of that in the Pakistan state of Sindh. So there's a bit of dry, arid area over there, and rainfall is very minimum, and all the scary heat wave incidents that come out of India every year are somewhat concentrated in this region. This is the place where summertime air temperature goes up to 50 degrees centigrade with dust storms and absolute lack of water, power outage, because then everybody wants to use the air conditioner, right? So then there's a drop in the power supply, and all of that happens. And I was based out of this city for a good 2.5 years, and my background enables me to conduct heat research during the extreme hot months of May and June in India. So I have had good fortune of doing some field work in some of these locations, and these are some of the photographs that I captured during the field work. So I was doing the field work in 50-degree heat for about 3 weeks every year during the last 3 years. So coming back to the small town part, this particular place, Jodhpur, is placed in a quite a bit isolated situation from the so-called the fertile part of Rajasthan. So connectivity wise, this is not very well connected with the bigger cities. There's just one airport, which also has just 2 or 3 flights running every day. Even in train or buses, you would require at least like 5-6 hours to reach to Jaipur, which happens to be the capital city of Rajasthan, and where I guess all the good infrastructure availability is present. So now coming back to Jodhpur, this was this historic capital of one of the erstwhile kingdom of Rajputana, and they built these massive forts on hilltop, and there is this small little residential community at the foothills of that hillock, and this is also known as Blue City. Now talking about the resilience part, because as you can see, the heading is about local resilience. So I guess I'm going to reiterate a lot of things that you have already mentioned. So the first thing, why this Blue City part is important. Firstly, if you see, this is a residential neighborhood, and the buildings are very close knit. There's not much of gap, right? Very inward looking. And very interestingly, why Blue City? Because they painted all the walls with lime indigo paint. And that's why it takes the color blue. Now, what's the significance? Again, it's totally related to locally led climate adaptation from the heat. How? So firstly, again, they used a lot of local materials. So all these residential buildings from 500 years back, their walls are quite thick because the local sandstone was used for the construction. So now the thickness of this wall actually restricts the daytime outdoor heat to penetrate to the indoors. So when it's very hot outdoors, you can actually understand, if you are there inside one of these residential quarters, you would understand that there's at least 10-degree cooler environment in the indoor rooms. without any air conditioning. Also, because there is a lot of sandstorm and dust storms, they place the windows at top. So the windows are close to the ceiling. The windows are not placed at, like the human level, generally what we see in the houses. Because in such cases, these windows placed at the top is allowing the dust to stay out, and only the air part is coming through some natural weight and velocity and some thermodynamical principle of how air flows, and the hot air, cool air phenomena, and all of that. And then again, they painted all these buildings with this lime indigo paint, because this is a very good reflecting coating. So what happens? It reflects back the entire heat. So that also eventually helps to keep the indoors cool. This is one takeaway, that all these 500 years old residential buildings, without having any access to any modern technology or any climate simulation or energy simulation or anything like that, they understood what was needed to be done. And the modern buildings in Jodhpur these days actually need air conditioning, but these buildings don't. So it's about the local resilience. Also, very strategically, in some of the quarters, in the little bit of open areas that they had, they made sure they were placing some step wells for water conservation. So that also induced some sort of ambient humidity in that environment, which eventually helped in lowering down the temperature through latent heat transfer. So very intelligently, very thoughtfully, these neighborhoods were designed some 500 years back. So that's the best part. Now we can also learn something from the things that are not working well. So that's about the precarious part of resource constraints. Now, given the fact that this is situated right in the middle of the desert, there is no proper access to outside world or something. Also, the literacy level is quite low. There's a lot of social stigma and social taboos are existing regarding women's participation, or there are so much of gendered roles and all these things are there. So that also hinders the growth and hinders the present day sustainability. So if you see the images on the right side of the screen, you would see there are neighborhoods that were meant to be walkable. Because again, coming back to the 15-minute city concept, or the walkable neighborhood concept, they did it in a manner where everything was accessible by walk. Even when there's a strong heat wave going on, or a strong storm going on, you can still access different places by walk, and being completely shaded from that environmental problem, as they place those buildings really close to each other. But then over the years, because of follies in the planning process or governance, or for whatever reason, slowly that essence got lost. And now more of vehicular usage is being promoted, but that is also increasing the urban heat island effect in the city. So now again, there's this increasing impetus on looking back to the older traditions about what actually worked well previously, and they're again trying to come up with certain strategies with the help of the learnings from the previous centuries, to make sure how they can again make the streets walkable, as well as they're trying to reduce the burden of different type of environmental exposures. So this place is also known for sandstone mining and quarrying. So that also impacts the air quality, and a lot of people have these respiratory chronic diseases. So they're also trying to come up with the previous learning, because sandstone was always there. Sandstone quarries were always there. But then how the previous people had a relatively fulfilling life, because these kings or the royal families from the previous centuries, they apparently lived till 80 years, 90 years of age. So they're also trying to figure out what were the things that worked well in the previous centuries without having the modern knowledge, or without having the modern any access to the modern technologies. So probably some of the locally adapted methods work better in terms of building design or outdoor space design or the spatial usage as well. So yeah, that's all I wanted to talk about today. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much indeed, Shreya. Can I ask the 5 speakers to come to the front queue, and we have a little time for questions before we can go to the refreshments. So thank you all very much indeed. We've had a tour around the world. Started with, well, I guess Chipping Camden. There's a photo of Chipping Camden. Herbert Lane lived in Chipping Camden, and then we've ended up across various continents and countries. I think that we might end on that comment, is it? If that's okay, that's a nice way. No, it's a nice way to bring this year's seminars together. And one of the key things about public seminars is actually talking together afterwards. So I want to make sure we'll have time to have the orange juice before it gets too warm. But I want to thank you all for joining us. And I think also, I mean, the subtext is about scale, essentially, how the scale of urban fabric affects, for positive or negative reasons, social interaction. So all our 5 speakers and our questions from the audience have brought that notion of scale together very effectively. I'm just going to leave you time now to enjoy your own company, or each other's company. I'd just like to say thank you to the King's Foundation, who've been funding these seminars, these public seminars. I think I'll have to get my records out, but almost a decade at least. And we will are planning next year's seminars around a variety of themes around healthy urbanism. The first one for your diaries is on the 14th of October, Wednesday the 14th of October, and we're working with Dr. Rosie Creswell at the University of Oxford, who works very closely with the Red Cross, has written a book about the Red Cross, and she will be leading a session, a seminar with speakers about how communities prepare or respond to emergencies or crises. So 14th of October, Wednesday, 5 o'clock for a cup of tea and 5:30 onwards. So hope to see you all here. But I'd just like to thank our speakers, Stephen, Lita, Pooja, Shreya and Fabio for their company. Thank you.